Hello everyone and welcome to our lecture for week 9. Today we're going to look at some literature or some ideas in relation to pollution control. Now our main objective really is to look at the effect of competitive markets on efficiency, and that's of course covered in chapter 12, and that particular chapter has been already covered in lecture 7. But the key point I want to re-emphasize is that competitive markets are efficient markets. And the reason they are efficient is that the price in these competitive markets is equal to the total cost relating to the product in that market. So the rule of thumb is that in order for the competitive market to be efficient, or for a market generally to be efficient, we want to have the price equal to the total costs if we're talking about a long-term equilibrium. Okay. So again, competitive markets are efficient, and in these markets the price is equal to cost. Now let's take that and use it to analyze an example from pollution control, something very similar to the example that we started with early on in week 1 in this course. So now let's assume that the polluters are the firms, and assume that these firms are in a competitive market and in long run equilibrium. Okay. Now assume victims are not consumers of the firm's products, so the victims of the pollution are not buying the product that these firms are producing. Okay, we'll explain that in a minute. Now, or the reason for this assumption. Now filtering, we assume that filtering reduces pollution but will not eliminate the pollution, and we'll assume first to start with that victims cannot affect the damages that they suffer. They can't do anything, like buying dryers for example. Okay, they can't do anything to affect the damage that they suffer. Later on we will relax this assumption. So our tables on page 108, table 13, and it sets up our example for this chapter. So we're saying there are two types of behavior for the firm, so they have to choose either to filter or not to filter. Okay. Now if they choose not to filter, okay, their production cost per unit will be assumed to be equal to 100. If they filter, then that goes up to 115 again per unit. Now the victim's pollution damage per unit is going to be assumed to be $40 if the firm does not filter, but it drops down by $30 if they filter. You can already see that if you invest $15 to install the filtration, the filtering system, or the screens, smoke screen, whatever you call it, then that $15 investment, if you like, is gonna return $30 benefit on the victims. Okay, but if you add up these costs, the costs from columns 2 and 3, or 1 and 2, so the firm's production cost per unit plus the victim's pollution damage per unit, the full cost then per unit would be 140 if we do not filter, but 125 if we filter. And because we are trying to get to the optimal outcome, or the efficient outcome, in this case we are looking at a reduction in the total costs, just like we did in previous weeks, and that will give us the total of that will give us the efficient outcome being filtering, because it produces a full cost per unit lower than that under not filtering. So the assumption here is that the benefit from both of these, the product itself is the same, but the difference is going to be in relation to costs. Now let's look at what's going to happen if we decide to have negligence or strict liability. Okay, now let's assume under negligence, so on page 108, the bottom there, it says under negligence, suppose firms are liable only if they do not filter. So we will set the standard again as usual at the efficient outcome. So if you filter, under negligence there's no liability for pollution, but if you don't filter, again we said filtering will not reduce pollution, not eliminate, right? But that's the standard, because that's the efficient outcome. So under negligence, okay, if the firm does not filter, they will see the full cost of their product or the unit. So that's going to be their production cost, but also they would be liable for the damages. However, if they do filter, then all that they look at is their own production cost. They are not responsible for the $10 damage that will still accrue to the victims if they filter, if the firm filters. Okay. Now, looking at that, you could see that the lower of these two is still again the option to filter. So the firm looks at that, okay, and backward induction in game theory, for example, they would look at that and then would say, before they do anything, all right, we should then go ahead and filter, which is great because that's exactly what we want to happen, because that's the efficient outcome. Everything's hunky-dory. Not quite, because as you can see here, remember, we said that these are competitive markets. So for them to be efficient, we need to have the full, we need to have the price equal to the total costs. Now you can see here that the cost to these firms under negligence, if they filter, is not the same as the full cost per the unit, because they're not responsible for the $10 in damages that accrue to the victims. Okay, you can see that there's a difference between 125 and 115, which means that the efficiency in that sense will not So let's move on. It says the general rule, even though the rule of negligence can, with an appropriate standard of care, induce firms to take the efficient amount of care, i.e. to install the filters, it generally leads to an inefficient level of output. Why is that? Because the market price does not reflect the full cost of the product. So the amount that they are going to produce of pollution is not going to be the optimal one, because of the discrepancy between the full cost of the unit that they produce and the full cost that they would be accountable or liable for. Alright, how about then in strict liability? So let's look at the last column. Of course, in strict liability means what? That the firms are going to always be accountable regardless. Okay, if there's harm from the pollution, it doesn't matter whether you have a filter or you don't have a filter, you have to pay the victim the damages for that pollution. So as you can see here, their liability under strict liability is going to be 140 and 125 respectively, which is exactly the full cost per unit of the unit that they produce. So now we have the price equal to the full cost, and we can say strict liability can induce firms to take the efficient amount of care and can induce consumers to purchase the efficient amount of the product. Okay, so when we talk about the previous general rule under negligence, and we said it generally leads to an inefficient level of output because the market prices don't reflect the full cost of the product, that also relates to the consumers. Okay, because of this difference between 115 and 125. So under strict liability, that problem does not occur. Right. Now, what if now we relax our previous assumption that victims do not affect the harm, so they don't affect the level of damage that they or the level of pollution that they face. Let's say that they can do something, and in this case, in particular case, let's say that they can purchase some sort of a pollution resistant paint to paint their houses with. Okay, so this is similar to our previous analysis on pages 460 pages 47 and 50, which is chapter 6, which is under chapter 6, and that's of course our third application, automobile accidents. Okay, now the efficient outcome then for our example here in chapter 13 is what? Is that the firms are going to filter. Okay, the firms are going to choose to install the filters, but also the victims can also or the efficient solution is also for the victims to use this pollution resistant paint. Okay, so now the efficient solution requires only consumers who value the good more than its full cost to purchase it. Okay, why is that? It's because of this added cost of the pollution resistant paint. Alright, what happens then now under negligence and strict liability? Now under negligence we said firms will choose to filter, victims choose to use the paint. The efficient outcome or the outcome is efficient because both take appropriate care. Okay. However, just like we saw in negligence earlier, the decision by consumers is not efficient, okay, because the price does not reflect the damage that occurs. because of the discrepancy again between the price and the total cost, there would be an inefficient outcome as far as the consumption of consumers of this product. Okay. All right. Under strict liability, the victims have no incentive to use the pollution resistant paint, because now under strict liability the firm has to compensate them regardless whether they use the paint or not. If they suffer damages, the firm has to pay. So no incentive to use the paint. In order then to make this efficient, we have to add a defense of contributory negligence. So the firm can raise this defense, which means that the victims will have to take care in order for them to be able to be compensated. So now both the firms and the victims are efficient with their level of care. Okay. So the price reflects these damages and efficient outcome will be purchased. And the general rule again is that the basic conclusions about these two rules, strict liability and negligence in pollution control previously, are not affected if the victims can reduce their damages by taking precautions. Alright. So that then brings us to the end of this lecture, and that brings us to the end of the lectures for this course. And I hope to I wish you all the best with your final exam. And as of course you should know by now, you should have your exam briefings, and take a very good look at the exam briefings, and all the best for the exam.